Prepare for stories that will have you avoiding national parks forever.
Despair over the mysterious disappearance of thousands.
And stare in confusion at the circumstances under which some of them are found.
All this and more weird history, strange science, and the paranormal.
It's nerve-rattling.
It's mind-blowing.
It's this week's bewildering and bitter cup of odd. Tonic.
Welcome to the parlor. I'm Jennifer.
And I'm Maxwell. Curl up on our velvet settee, dear guest, and dearly hold your warm teacup for comfort. We're going to be mapping to some rather strange and unsettling territory.
Yes, it's unsettling in a couple of ways. First is the nature of the topic. We'll be discussing missing person cases, which are always distressing, but they're even more distressing when they don't end happily. So if young ears are listening, you may want to use your discretion.
Also unsettling are the nature of these mysterious cases. Many mysteries describe a single, terrifying event like, "What's that in the sky?" Or, "How is my salad levitating?" And, "Who is that standing in my bedroom?"
However, the mystery of tonight's disappearances are like a Russian doll, nested in layer upon layer of confounding riddles, where clues only take the mind into darker and more troubling realms.
Let's jump right in and travel back to October 2006, where we join two hunters in northern Minnesota.
In October of 2006, good friends Cory Kelly and Jim Naprude were planning a hunting trip together. The pair decided to go grouse hunting in northern Minnesota in an area that Cory was very familiar with. Cory made the trip from his home in Crookstown, Minnesota to the Red Lake State Wildlife Management Area, and Jim joined him at the campsite mid-afternoon on October 16th. Cory was excited to introduce this patch of wilderness to his friend for the first time, since Cory had grown up exploring it and had many fond childhood memories. The men started to set up their camp when Jim realized they had forgotten to get gas. Jim offered to take the truck into Foretown and make the purchase, while Cory stayed behind with Jim's golden Labrador, Sammy. As Jim headed out, Cory took his gun and headed 200 feet south of camp in search of grouse. When Jim arrived back at the campsite 1.5 hours later, Cory and Sammy were not in sight. It did look as if he had been collecting firewood, so perhaps he was still traveling back and forth to bring the wood to camp. As the afternoon light slowly slipped away, Jim started to become nervous, but he tried to calm his worry. He could see that Cory had taken his shotgun, and Cory knew the area well. Perhaps he had decided to hunt a little before the sun went down and was now heading back. And again, he had his winter gear, a cell phone, a lighter, a dog for protection, and he had years of experience in outdoor skills and wilderness survival. It started to rain, and darkness engulfed the campsite. Fearing that perhaps Cory was indeed lost, Jim honked the truck horn in an effort to alert him to the location. The hours ticked by, and Jim went to sleep hoping that Cory would return later. He did not. The next morning, Jim woke up at 4 a.m. to search for his friend. Not familiar with the area, he walked almost 2 miles in an effort to find Cory, but he could not find a trace of him. Jim eventually flagged down 2 people passing by the campsite, explaining that his friend was missing and asked them to notify law enforcement. Searchers combed the area of the campsite and then, with the use of ATVs, started to expand their search into the wilderness. The terrain was difficult, with tall grasses, swamps, and many bogs. For almost 2 weeks, searchers found no clues. There was no sign of any emergency shelter or any signals that a skilled hiker might leave to alert searchers of his whereabouts. It was as if Cory had simply vanished.
On Wednesday, October 25th, 9 days later, 2 hunters who were 9 miles from Jim and Cory's campsite found Jim's dog, Sammy, wandering in the woods. The dog was dehydrated and hungry, but in general good condition. Cory was not with him. 3 days later, searchers found Cory's cigarette lighter and cigarettes on a dirt trail. Even more concerning was the find on October 29th, when trackers discovered Cory's overalls, socks, and hooded sweatshirt, 14 miles from the original campsite. Searches were halted for snow and bad conditions, but resumed in mid-November, using Minnesota's best search dogs. Before quitting for the winter, 2 different searches, each lasting approximately 2 weeks, had scoured the location where his clothing was located. In late April, the search for Cory resumed, with the sheriff's department flying over the area where Cory's clothes and other personal belongings had been discovered. The air team spotted a body among 8-foot-tall reeds, 15 feet off the trail, and not far from where his clothes were found. The body was Cory Kelly's. Jan Kelly, Cory's mother, discussed how the sheriff's department had concluded that Cory had died the first night of his disappearance, but they were bewildered over how Cory had traveled 14 miles in that length of time through impossible swamps and bogs. Jan had her doubts. "I can't believe he could have gotten that far," she said. It was also determined that on that fateful night, Cory Kelly's cell phone was never used.
Welcome to the world of Missing 411, a name coined by David Paulides for missing person cases that defy logical and conventional explanations. A former police detective turned writer and investigator, Paulides is known for his 8 published books in his Missing 411 series. Tonight, we have selected a few stories from his 2012 book, Missing 411, Eastern United States, Unexplained Disappearances of North Americans that have never been solved. Missing 411 is a kind of play on words. 411 is the pre-internet reference for dialing 411 on your phone for information.
Ask your parents, kids. Phones once didn't have cameras on them.
The term Missing 411 refers to the information we have on these disappearances and how that information itself is largely missing. According to Paulides, his work on disappearance cases began when an off-duty national park ranger expressed concern about the questionable nature of some of the missing person cases that have occurred in the parks. This led to Paulides investigating vanishings in all national parks across the U.S., and eventually broadening his investigation to include missing people around the world. In regard to the Cory Kelly incident, Paulides said he has personally studied the case for 2 years. "It has disturbed me," he confides. "There's something very, very wrong with the scenario presented by the sheriff," he says, referring to their concluded time of death and the distance Cory had traveled in one night. He is also disturbed by the state of Sammy, Jim's dog, when he was found roaming the woods. Searchers also stated that Sammy was dehydrated, Paulides observes. There is more fresh water in the Red Lake area than most people could possibly imagine. How could Sammy be dehydrated unless the dog was somehow confined or restricted in its movements?
There are a lot of hows, whys, and why didn't he's in this story. How could Cory have gotten lost in an area that he's known for 25 years? Why didn't he use his phone for help, or his lighter, or his camping skills for survival?
And if he was menaced or attacked, why was the dog not barking? And why were shots not fired?
Right. And why do authorities think that he died the first night, despite the fact that he was found 14 miles from his camp through bogs and swamps and other impossible-to-cross terrain? And why couldn't the search dogs, over the course of 13 days, find the body that was lying near his clothes?
And most disturbingly, why were Cory's clothes removed?
Exactly. Paulides says that because they don't fall under federal jurisdiction, the state authorities don't have to release their full reports. And in this case, the Beltrami Sheriff's Department hasn't, including the full coroner's report. Surely, with a case this odd, family and friends deserve all the answers they could get, right?
They do, but it seems like there could be some stonewalling going on.
Agreed.
Perhaps, dear guest, some clues can be gleaned from another disappearance.
On February 7th, 1970, 3 scouts and 2 adults of the Boy Scout Troop No. 95 entered the Great Smoky Mountains National Park to hike the Appalachian Trail. The first night, they camped at Icewater Springs, and the next day began their hike along the trail, which is well marked with large signs and on a very distinct path. At 9:30 a.m., the group reached their first rest stop, where their trail met with another, the Boulevard Trail. It was also at this time that the group began noticing that one of their scouts, 16-year-old Jeffrey Hague, was lagging behind. As the group started westward for the Newfound Gap parking lot, Jeffrey stated he was going to wait for a senior scout, the last person in line, and that they would walk out together. The 3 leading hikers reached the parking lot just as snow flurries were starting. The last scout soon arrived, but without Jeffrey, who he said had not been waiting for him at the Boulevard Trail junction. It was at this point that the troop walked the entire route back to Icewater Springs, but found no sign of Jeffrey. Then the group walked down the Boulevard Trail fork in case Jeffrey had made a mistake. There was still no sign of the scout. They then went straight to the car and drove to the park headquarters to report that Jeffrey was missing. It was now 3 p.m., and there was heavier snow coming down. The Park Service immediately sent search teams to 3 different trailheads, to no avail. The scout group was obviously getting concerned, but they also knew that Jeffrey had 3 years' experience as a scout and was carrying warm clothes, a sleeping bag, food, and had matches. The next day, search teams brought in a full winter search. Search dogs, the Civilian Air Patrol, county sheriffs, and other emergency personnel were contacted and started to converge on the park. Unfortunately, recent snow had covered any tracks Jeffrey would have made. The following week saw hundreds of searchers join the effort, covering thousands of acres. Nothing of value was found.
8 days after he went missing, searchers found Jeffrey's backpack. It was found on a rock in the middle of a river 1 mile downstream from the Boulevard Trail. Jeffrey would have had been in the river to place it on the rock in this position. His sleeping bag, food, matches, and other equipment were with the bag and were lying on the rock as though someone had been taking inventory. Concern was growing as Jeffrey did not have his needed supplies to survive. The next day, the Army used a canine search team that followed a scent trail, and they came to the conclusion that Jeffrey was out of the park. They followed the scent until it eventually met with U.S. Route 441 and supposedly ended. 10 days after his disappearance, a group of 30 searchers decided to focus on the river. The Green Berets focused on the ridgeline, and an avalanche team focused on the creek basin. At 10:17 a.m. that morning, they found Jeffrey's body. He was found a mile below the Boulevard Trail, about 1,000 yards upstream from where his pack and sleeping bag were found 2 days before. He was at the base of a tree, half sitting, half slumped in the fetal position and partially covered in snow. He had no socks on, and one boot was lying 6 feet away. The other was half laced and half on his right foot. His orange toboggan cap was off. His mittens were off. His coat was open and partially off. His shirt was on, but his pants were unzipped and partially removed. The state medical examiner said he had some scratches and bruises, but no broken bones. The conclusion was that Jeffrey had died of exhaustion and exposure within 2 days of disappearing.
Paulides shares his thoughts. He says, "You may hear some search and rescue people state that Jeffrey just froze to death. I don't think so. It's much more complicated than that. Jeffrey didn't have any broken bones, and he could walk. His pack, his sleeping bag, and supplies were not that far away. he could have recovered them. He had Boy Scout training. He knew how to start a fire. The trails were very clearly marked. There would be no reason for him to travel to where he was found. And as a trained Boy Scout, there was no reason that he would have ever entered the river. None. And no reports mention if Jeffrey's pants seemed wet or frozen from the river.
There are many who will try to explain away these incidents as examples of what happens when a mind is suffering from hypothermia. Paulides makes this counterpoint. There have been hundreds who have frozen to death on Mount Everest, and many have been found. And I have never heard of any climber who was found frozen to death with his or her pants partially on. And dear guest, stories like these run into the hundreds, perhaps thousands.
On August 23, 2008, Michael Huron, 51, of Happy Valley, Tennessee, put his wallet, keys, cell phone, money clip, credit cards, and gun on the kitchen counter and took an ATV from his garage and drove it down his street. After he didn't arrive to mow his parents' yard, they went to his residence and found his ATV a mile down the road. It was sitting idle with the ignition switch turned on and had been turned off by the kill switch, something his children said he would never do. It was still in high gear, ready to accelerate up a hill. Michael was never heard from again.
John Davis was reported missing on August 26, 1956, during work as a sheep herder. A search of his employer's ranch was conducted for 2 weeks with no results. 5 months later, a witness investigated a strange object under the snow. It was the body of John Davis. The section of the field where the body was found had been thoroughly searched during the time of Davis's disappearance. Police concluded that there was no evidence of foul play, despite the fact that Davis's clothes were in a pile near his naked body.
While hunting together November 11, 1926, Alfred Bishop and his friend Morris Gallagher of Reading, Vermont, decided to split up and regroup later. Bishop never came back. Approximately 24 hours later, searchers found Bishop's body beside an abandoned road. There was evidence of a terrific struggle in the snow, which was beaten down a distance of 60 paces around the body. Strewn about in different directions were Bishop's rifle, coat, and gloves. A preliminary examination disclosed no wounds on Bishop's body. A full autopsy failed to solve the mystery of the man's death.
During the same month, but 17 years later, 35 miles southeast of where Bishop's body was found, Carl Herrick became separated from his cousin while hunting deer and never arrived back at camp. A search was started, but it began to snow the night he vanished. On the third day of searching, Carl's cousin found him lying on the ground, dead. He found Carl's face blackened with minor scratches on his arms and hands. There were alleged huge bear tracks on the ground in the area. Carl's rifle was found against a tree 70 feet away. There was one expended round on the ground near the rifle. Acting coroner Carlos Otis discovered that the victim's lung had been punctured by a rib. He concluded that a bear had cuffed Carl about the head, but killed him by squeezing him to death. No bite marks or deep claw marks were found.
Squeezed to death by a bear.
Mm-hmm. I mean, with that kind of logic, it's just as likely he was squeezed to death by a feral pro wrestler. Was there a broken chair nearby? If only there were cases where people have vanished in the company of others so we could better understand what's happening.
Well, as it turns out, there are. In fact, there are also cases where the vanished victims were found still alive. What did they have to say? When we return, we'll hear their testimony.
Never split the party, dear guest. Odd Tonic will be right back. We hope. Do you remember life before Odd Tonic?
Perhaps you don't, because the screen memories that cover up the truth of your alien abduction work all too well.
Never mind that. Now you're here with us in the parlor, sipping hot tea by the candlelight and listening to more strangely fascinating stories than you could have ever experienced on your own.
Until those screen memories wear off.
Help other oddlings find their way to the parlor as well. Building a listenership is still very important to us this first year, and leaving us a kind review on iTunes really helps us out.
And don't forget to find us on social media. Our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram can all be found at Odd Tonic Society.
And support us at Patreon and earn some unique and spooky rewards at patreon.com/oddtonic.
And if you have a personal story of the unexplained that you would like to share with us, email it to theparlor@oddtonicsociety.com. Either spelling of parlor is fine. Your tale could be featured on a future edition of Odd Tonic Parlor Stories.
Now back to more disturbing and disconcerting disappearances.
Welcome back. So far, we've been exploring the strange and unusual cases of individuals vanishing in America's national parks, as documented in David Paulides' book, Missing 411, Eastern United States. But the stories get more compelling and even more perplexing as we explore instances in which people simply vanish within mere yards of others.
In Ellerslie, Georgia, Christopher Tompkins was 20 years old when he worked for a surveying company as part of a 4-man team. On January 25, 2002, shortly after lunch, all the workers were walking on the shoulder of Highway 85, approximately 50 feet apart. When work associates last saw Chris, he was near the back of the group and near the side of the road. A minute passed and the crew looked behind them. Chris had completely disappeared. There was a tall barbed wire fence between the shoulder of the road and the private property that bordered the highway. When his fellow employees went back to the area where Chris was last seen, they found one of his boots lying near the fence and some coins lying near the boot on the grass. They also found tools that Chris had on him, lying and scattered on the ground near the fence. A piece of blue cloth was found on the barbed wire near his boot, and it was fiber that matched the blue jeans he was wearing. The area on the other side of the fence was best described as heavily wooded with swamps, snakes, and very thick vegetation, a place most wouldn't want to go. Chris was never found.
On October 8, 1976, 16-year-old Trenny Lynn Gibson was with a group of 40 fellow students from Knoxville, Tennessee's Bearden High School who hiked the Appalachian Trail in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. At approximately 3 p.m. toward the end of the hike, Trenny was walking with a group of students about a half mile from the parking area. This area had a very defined trail and very steep, rugged, hazardous forest terrain on each side, discouraging you from stepping off of it. A student, Miss Coghill, was approximately 200 feet from Trenny and said, "Trenny bent over the trail to look at something near a flat rock and then disappeared to the right of the trail." Another student named Anita stated, "She was on the trail when I last saw her. I looked away, and when I looked back, Trenny was nowhere in sight. I should have been able to see her if she went up the trail. I checked the area where Trenny was last seen. I yelled, but there was no answer." The official NPS report mentions the weather during the first night of the search. Quote, "Weather at this time with strong winds and heavy rain with temperatures in the low 30s. At 9:15 p.m., moderate to heavy rains." In all, 300 people had participated in the search for Trenny that year. The search included trackers, dogs, rescue squads, helicopters, airplanes, and deputies. Trenny was never found.
Are you starting to see patterns here, dear guest, including how inclement weather always seems to descend the area immediately after the disappearance?
We certainly are. And here's another pattern. In every case where someone disappears within sight of another, and there are many, It always happens silently and in a split second when everyone just happens to be looking away, no matter the number of people present.
And the victim often appears to be acting strangely before the vanishing, oddly lagging in the back of line, stepping off trail, or running ahead of a group and turning a corner or cresting a small hill, only to be gone when the others do the same a moment later. And when the group stands in the spot where the victim was last seen, there's no sign of them, even when it seems doubtful that the victim could have covered the distance to be out of sight in such a short amount of time.
If only we could find a clue. If only we could find one of the missing people still alive.
As a matter of fact, dear guest, we have several, and their accounts will leave you mystified.
When Katie Flynn was 3 years old, her father, Henry Flynn, ran a lumber camp outside of Walhalla, Michigan in 1868. Katie would often ride with her father as he drove a team of horses up the hill with lumber for the mill. Afterwards, she would then run back down the hill for home. On one of these trips down, the little girl didn't make it back. A search ensued. At approximately 4 p.m. the next day, searchers heard a feeble cry. The men followed the sound through the brush and toward the river. Just before the men reached the water, they saw a huge black bear jump into the river and disappear across to the other side. They found Katie standing on a tree that was lying on the ground and crossing the water flow. When they asked her what happened, Katie said, "Big Dog came up to me, took me in his arms, and walked away with me." When asked where one of her shoes were, she replied, "Big Dog ate it." She said that after her father had left to unload the wagon, she had played a little while in the sand when a big black thing came along and played with her. Then it held out its paw, she took it, and the thing walked away with her. Just before dark, it had left her for a while, and when it came back, its paw was full of wintergreen berries. The bear, as she also called it, ate some of the berries, and she ate some. Then it scraped a big pile of leaves next to her, and it lay down close to her for the night, trying to cover her with its body. Paulides notes that, being so young, Katie didn't understand what had taken her. But one thing's clear. Bears do not walk away hand in paw with little girls. Feed them, make them a bed, and cuddle with them all night.
One story that mimics Katie's is the disappearance of a 2.5-year-old girl with the last name of Davis who lived in Boyceville, New York. On or about May 9th, 1888, Davis disappeared, and she was found 24 hours and 2 miles from her residence in a deep rural valley. Davis told her family that she was taken by a big bear and slept with that bear through the night. This story can be found in the May 15th, 1888 edition of the New York Times.
Helen Chenoweth disappeared from her cousin's farm on March 28, 1940. She was 3 years old. After an extensive search, they found her 47 hours later, unconscious but still alive, in an adjacent muddy pig lot. Her hands and feet were clean, and her clothes were barely wrinkled. In fact, they were completely dry, even though there had been heavy rains the night before. She was found in an area previously searched many times. She couldn't say where she had been or how she remained in good health after 2 nights of unfavorable weather.
Brenda Jean Dowd was 5 years old when she disappeared while camping with her family in 1958 in Eagle Pond, New York. Heavy rains impeded the search, but she was found 2 miles away, 50 hours after her disappearance. The girl was missing her shirt, shoes, socks, and pants, and was only wearing her underwear. Her clothes were never found. Brenda was very quiet about her experience, but she said she saw 3 bears, 2 asleep and 1 awake.
On May 14, 1950, a 2-year-old Jackie Copeland attended a company picnic with his family outside of Pleasantville, Pennsylvania. The family was socializing with others when Jackie disappeared. By late evening, searchers with bloodhounds could not pick up a scent, or they, for some reason, refused to search. At 8 a.m. the following day, 2 miles from the picnic area, searchers combed an area completely surrounded by impassable swamps. As they did so, they quite accidentally spotted Jackie, in good health, peeking at them from behind a tree. When asked why he had left the picnic, he said he saw something peering at him from behind a tree. When he approached, the creature scampered into the brush, and he followed.
Evangeline Lorimer was 21 years old when vacationing with her father in the Great Smoky Mountains National State Park in 1951. She told her father she was going to go for a hike. Evangelina didn't return, and Mr. Lorimer called the authorities. As canines were brought in for the search, heavy rains moved in, hammering the park for several days. In the middle of the search, Evangelina's coat was found hanging from a tree limb 5 miles from where she disappeared. On the 13th day, she was found walking down a trail. She had swollen ankles and bug bites, but was in relatively good condition. The ranger stated she was vague and confused.
On July 30th, 1911, 24-year-old Elsie Davis was walking home from church and vanished. Searchers found her comb and several footprints in the hills behind her home. On the 5th day of the search, volunteers found a number of Elsie's personal items, hosiery, her coat, and shoes scattered on the ground 3 miles away. They heard a stick break, and the searchers continued deeper into the woods. Hearing something while under a large pine tree, they looked skyward. 20 feet up in the tree, they found a scantily clad Elsie Davis. She did not answer when they called her name. After they made their way up, they discovered she didn't seem to be able to speak. She walked back with them silently, her head on her father's shoulder. Doctors said she was fighting, quote, a remarkable fever and delirium.
78-year-old Nora Moore lived in an elderly living facility in the rural area of Gardendale, Alabama. She had severe ankle and hip injuries that greatly inhibited her ability to walk. On July 18, 1995, Nora had disappeared. A formal search was launched. On the 6th day, a searcher in a previously inspected area, a quarter-mile from home, found Nora lying on her side near a creek in a semi-conscious condition. She was missing her shoes and stockings, and she complained that someone was continually throwing water on her while she was out in the woods, a statement she could never explain. She was in satisfactory condition considering she was in the woods for 6 days. As searchers were carrying her from the forest, they found broom sage, an edible perennial shrub from the southwest United States, in the pockets of her sweater. She could not explain its presence.
Eloise Lindsay, 22, planned a detailed 43-mile hike along the Appalachian Trail in 1989. She was to travel the first 7 days alone, and then was to meet a friend for fresh supplies and companionship. She never met her friend, who then alerted authorities. On the 16th day of being declared missing, she was found by a hunter 5 miles off the trail and in the deep woods, delirious and semi-conscious. When interviewed, Eloise stated that on the 3rd day, she knew she was being followed by a group of men who, although she couldn't see them, she knew they meant her harm. I was terrorized the entire time, she said. I could tell there was no good intent involved. After several days of being chased, she ditched her backpack and supplies and left the trail in an attempt to lose the men. She stated there were nights when she didn't sleep, as she did everything possible to avoid them. During Eloise's chase through the woods, she stated that she found 2 pieces of pound cake and stale donuts hidden inside the trunk of a tree. Her story never wavered.
Paulides mentions that Gail Lindsay, Eloise's mother, was interviewed and stated, "I don't know what she saw," implying that Eloise had perhaps confided in her mother that she had indeed seen something. Nobody ditches their backpack so they can run faster unless they're in serious fear. When a hiker leaves their pack, they may be leaving their life behind. she chose to leave her sleeping bag, food, and water purification behind in order to get away from whatever was pursuing her.
Paulides also recounts a conversation he had with Dwight McCarter, a retired NPS ranger, about a vanishing in Smoky Mountains National Park. McCarter made the incredible statement that there were several, quote, wild men in the park. They were hairy, dirty, and one even had an old bearskin that he wore. McCarter was careful with his words, but did state that these men lived in the wild and were living off the land. The only wild men he knew in the park at the time lived at the other end of the valley and didn't venture into the area the disappearance occurred.
Careful with his words. Wild men.
Hairy wild men who live off the land in the woods.
Who also seem to have an appetite for cakes, which are taken and apparently stored inside tree trunks.
And who, dear guest, does this sound like to you?
What size shoe do you think he wears?
Okay, despite where we landed here, I don't think we're anywhere near a simple answer. But I do think it's safe to conclude one thing. These victims are not getting lost on their own. I think it's clear that they are getting abducted or otherwise displaced by some force.
I agree, but what could it be? I mean, physics seem to bend in some of these cases.
Yeah.
How are people disappearing and reappearing miles away in a time frame that doesn't make sense?
Yeah.
Particularly when they're children or they have mobility challenges. How do they sometimes reappear in an area that's already been thoroughly searched?
Yeah.
It kind of smacks a little bit of time slip phenomena.
Yeah, it really does. And how do you explain the strange behavior of the victims just before disappearing? When you read story after story, it just seems like the victims are lured or even like compelled into doing something outside of their rational thought. And it makes you wonder, are the people who are nearby all compelled to turn away from the victim at the same moment? Or are the abductors somehow hyper-attuned to awareness and can sense when all focus will be turned away?
And what's going on with the weather? In just the few cases we covered, you can see how a blustery rainstorm or a snowstorm seems to immediately descend and hamper first-day rescue efforts.
Yeah.
Are the abductors perfectly reading the weather before they strike? I mean, are they controlling it? Think of the many paranormal cases we read where storms seem to hit just before or after an event,
Right.
including thick, mysterious fogs.
And why, Jennifer? What is the end goal of the abduction? With the clothing removal, you would assume the victims are getting eaten or violated, which apparently isn't the case. The cause of the deaths seem to be natural, if you can call sitting a yard away from your pack and sleeping bag and dying of exposure natural. Is this lethargy from the mysterious disorientation and this undiagnosable fever that is seen in the survivors? And then there's the cases we didn't even cover where the bodies seem hastily redressed with one or more garments turned inside out.
Yeah. So far this year, we've shared stories of ESP, time slips, spontaneous human combustion. But what I find terrifying about these stories is they just seem so close to reality. They can happen in real moments without warning. It just feels like in a snap, someone you love could be gone.
We really do need that rope around each other at the grocery store, don't we? I think this wraps up this edition of Odd Tonic. If you want to learn more about this phenomenon, check out the many Missing 411 books by David Paulides. Plus, he has produced 2 documentaries. The most recent one was released early this summer and is called Missing 411, The Hunted. We have barely scratched the surface of the 9,000 plus hours of research he has done. Visit canammissing.com for more details and to purchase his books. We will put the links in the show notes.
With any luck, we'll be back next week with more weird history, strange science, and paranormal peculiarities.
This is, dear guest, goodbye for now. But remember, if you are ever enjoying a lovely autumn hike in the woods, when you hear a snap of a branch behind you, a long howl in the distance, or muffled footsteps approaching from a turn on the trail. Don't worry.
It's just us.
Good night.